endocrine gland. The regions of the adrenal gland are going to differ really significantly, both anatomically as well as physiologically, whereas the cortex is going to act very much like an endocrine gland. The medulla is very neural in nature, and it's going to be receiving inputs from our nervous system, as you might recall, to release epinephrine as well as norepinephrine. And so that's going to be, those two hormones are going to be involved in the fight or flight response, so very much acute stress with the medulla, whereas with the adrenal cortex, we're going to see that it's more responsible for responses to chronic stress. So let's take a closer look. Within the cortex, you have three anatomical regions. You have the zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. And those are listed in the order going from the capsule, that would be on the outside of the adrenal gland, medial. So moving from outside in this case. Now, with each of those three regions, you're going to see subtle differences in the physiology as well. So let's take a look at those. And I think laying things out in this format may be useful. So with the zona glomerulosa, we'll start there first. So zona glomerulosa, there's a mnemonic that I like to use, and that's blood, sugar, sex, magic. This is kind of a fun one. So with the glomerulosa, the reason that it can be linked to blood is one of the key hormones that I'd like you to know that's excreted from this region is a hormone called aldosterone. And the link to blood is actually blood pressure. So aldosterone is a critical hormone that's released when our blood pressure falls, and it allows us to bring that blood pressure back up. And aldosterone is actually going to fall under a class of corticosteroids that we're going to call mineral corticoids. With the zona fasciculata, that can be linked to the term sugar. So the reason for that is because a key hormone coming from the zona fasciculata is one that we're all familiar with, is cortisol. And you're probably most familiar with cortisol as it helps us to resist stressors. It also influences the energy metabolism of a lot of our cells. But the link to sugar is one that I would like you to know. It provokes a process called gluconeogenesis. So literally the creation, I can write that down here. So gluconeogenesis. So genesis referring to creation, neo referring to new, and gluco referring to sugar. So what cortisol does is it actually allows our body to better mobilize sugar in the body during times of stress. And so that's a great way to link the zona fasciculata with the release of this particular hormone that it releases. So cortisol. And cortisol is going to fall under the class of hormones called glucocorticoids. Glucocorticoids. Forgot the C there. And then, as I noted a moment ago, just to be consistent, aldosterone is going to fall under the class of mineral corticoids. So it's a whole class that you can think about influencing the minerals or the ions, if you will. And aldosterone is definitely the critical one that I'd like you to be aware of. And then, so last up is the zona reticularis. And it is the case that you get a little bit of the hormones that I'm about to mention coming from the zona fasciculata, but most of them are going to come from the zona reticularis. And those hormones are the gonadocorticoids. This is going to include a lot of weak androgens, including testosterone. And so that's the link here with sex. So gonads, right? Think testes and ovaries. The gonads, I don't want you to lose sight of the fact that although these are hormones that are involved with with sex and reproduction, bear in mind that the gonads, the testes and ovaries, are still very much the primary source of gonatocorticoids. I will say that after menopause in women, the zona reticularis plays a more dominant role since the ovaries are no longer secreting estrogen. So blood is linked to aldosterone because of an increase in blood pressure that it stimulates. So blood pressure goes up because of aldosterone. The zona fasciculata is related to the release of cortisol, which increases our blood sugar. And the zona reticularis is going to release gonatocorticoids, including testosterone, which is going to be linked to sex. So blood, sugar, sex, and then magic. I just alluded to this a moment ago, but the medulla, right, is going to release epinephrine as well as norepinephrine. So epinephrine is just another word for adrenaline, right? So there's again the link between that term and the connection to the adrenal gland.
I wanted to elaborate a bit on the term magic and that mnemonic that I gave. When you think about the adrenal medulla and the catecholamines, the epinephrine and norepinephrine that's released, note the vast majority of the hormone coming from here is epinephrine, but you can tie those to the term magic because consider how widespread the effects are. This is secretory activity controlled by the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, so fight or flight. And you've got receptors for epinephrine all over the body, notably in the bronchioles to allow for bronchial dilation, to increase breathing rate in a situation where we need to remove ourselves safely or if we're being chased by a bear, right? In addition, increases heart rate, increases blood pressure, sweaty palms, sweat glands are stimulated. So the effects from these catecholamines are very widespread. So I think you can nicely tie that to the word magic.
So blood, sugar, sex, magic is a nice mnemonic to bear in mind the sequence or the order of hormones that are released from these different regions of the adrenal cortex. So I also want to show a histology picture to to introduce you guys to what this looks like. So what you're seeing here, so this is all part of the capsule. So everything here is going to be the capsule that wraps around the adrenal glands. Over here, I know it's subtle, and all of these divides are subtle, right? It's not as though there's really clear delineations among them, but this is all part of the medulla. And then, so what you're looking for are the three additional bands. So I particularly like to look for the zona fasciculata first. I feel like this region, it's difficult to see that. So fasciculata is going to go from about here to about there. And one of the features that I think helps this region stand out is you get these longer banding patterns. You can see that the shape and the orientation of the cells is going to be a little bit different in the fasciculata. In other images, it's a little bit more clear, but you get these long strips. And then so once I identify the fasciculata, then I know, and I identify the medulla, then I place the glomerulus here. So you can see ZG, glomerulus, and then lastly, the reticularis is going to be all through here. So reticularis. All of the hormones that are released here, they fall under the class of corticosteroids. So again, you've got the mineralocorticoids, the glucocorticoids, and the gonatocorticoids. So all of those corticosteroids are only going to be released from the cortex if the cortex is stimulated upstream. So think to yourself, what's the hormone, the tropic hormone that stimulates the cortex? And hopefully you remembered ACTH, so adrenocorticotropic hormone, which is going to be released from the pituitary gland and specifically going to be released from the anterior pituitary. And so you're only going to see the release of those corticoids if the anterior pituitary first tells the cortex that it can do so, through the release of ACTH.
So what you're seeing is a closer look at short-term stress and versus prolonged stress. So I noted at the beginning of this video that the adrenal gland is really responsible for both. So with the fight or flight response that we were just seeing, right, this is going to be an axon, a sympathetic fiber that's coming. It's stimulating the adrenal medulla. Here's our epi and norepinephrine. And here are all those short-term stress responses that we were just looking at. Pretty much all the ones that I noted. You also get increased glucose in the blood. With chronic stress, so here you're seeing all of those other corticosteroids come into place. So ACTH being released from the anterior pituitary, acting on the adrenal cortex. Mineral corticoids shown here, glucocorticoids shown here. So mineral corticoids, the one that I asked you to know is aldosterone. The reason that it increases blood pressure, retain fluid, so it increases our blood volume. We're retaining certain salts, certain ions, and water follows salt. So as our blood volume increases, so does blood pressure. But think about the implications there from a clinical standpoint and linking this to hypertension. Think about how many people who are under chronic stress exhibiting symptoms of hypertension. So there's a real connection there. Similarly, over here with the glucocorticoids, right? This was the one that I linked to sugar. And I noted the term gluconeogenesis, which is when you take proteins and fats, alternative sources of fuel, and you actually convert them to glucose for energy. So glucocorticoids stimulate that. Increased blood sugar in the body is something that's seen with type 2 diabetes, right? Blood glucose increases with chronic stress as well as with acute stress. This one's interesting. So cortisol, in addition to increasing blood sugar, it also suppresses the immune system. So I don't think you have to make too far of a leap of faith to make some connections here between chronic stress and autoimmune diseases. It's widely known that those who have autoimmune diseases, their symptoms flare when they're under stress. And I think you see a real link here as well. So I think it's important as we go through the adrenal gland and look at these various hormones to make these clinical connections so we can see the big picture.